The storm passed sooner than expected. Water kept rising afterward. Thousands were trapped together. In the late summer of 2005, the city of New Orleans moved with a calm and steady rhythm. Warm air drifted in from the Gulf and spread across quiet streets. Soft light touched rooftops and wrapped the city in a gentle glow. People stepped outside with slow, relaxed motions that matched the mood of the season. The day opened like many days before it. Streetcars rolled along their tracks with a smooth, ringing sound. Their motion felt steady and familiar. Vendors opened market stalls with patient hands. They moved crates, set up cloth covers, and arranged fruit in simple, bright rows. Their voices rose in friendly calls that blended with the hum of the morning. These sounds shaped the identity of the city. Children played outside and chased each other along narrow sidewalks. They laughed as they ran between houses painted in warm colors. A few dogs barked from shady porches, but soon settled again. Parents watched with soft smiles while they prepared for daily tasks. These small scenes of life gave the city its warmth. Music drifted through open windows in the French Quarter. A sax player tested slow notes to warm his breath. A piano carried a gentle melody from a dim corner bar where staff swept the floor. The music mixed with the smell of coffee and sweet pastries from nearby cafes. Tourists walked at an easy pace and pointed at old balconies with iron rails. The Superdome rose above the city with a broad and solid shape. Morning light slid across its curved surface and gave it a calm silver tone. People thought of it as a place of celebration and shared pride. It held memories of loud games and joyful crowds. On this quiet day, it seemed strong and reassuring. Few imagined how soon it would change. Inside the dome, maintenance crews made simple checks on lights and vents. They spoke about weekend plans and laughed at familiar jokes. Their work felt routine and light. Large hallways stood empty, except for the echo of distant steps. The building carried a peaceful stillness. Across the city, workers prepared for another warm day. A teacher sorted papers on her small living room table. She checked her planner and set out materials for the next school week. A cook at a local diner cracked eggs on a metal counter while a radio played soft background news. A young father tied his daughter's shoes before walking her to a neighbor. These moments shaped the human heart of the city. Cars moved through wide streets lined with long shadows. Drivers kept windows open to let warm air pass through. A few people paused to greet friends with short, friendly waves. Life moved with a patient ease that made the city feel grounded. Nothing in the air suggested sudden change. Clouds gathered lightly near the horizon as midday approached. They stretched across the sky in soft white shapes. No one felt concern. Clouds came and went. The breeze stayed warm and gentle. Radios mentioned activity in the Gulf, but the tone stayed calm. Residents trusted the familiar flow of summer days. New Orleans breathed with a sense of peace that felt deep and steady. Families planned meals and simple evening gatherings. Musicians practiced slow lines for later shows. Shops filled with steady footsteps and soft conversation. The Superdome waited with quiet strength. The city moved forward, unaware of how quickly this calm would fade or how deeply the coming days would alter every life. Morning light spread across New Orleans as the city eased into another warm day. People moved through simple routines that shaped the rhythm of their lives. Families prepared breakfast with slow, steady motions.
Children searched for misplaced shoes. Radios played soft music mixed with light news. The tone felt calm and familiar. In small neighborhoods, parents called out to their kids with gentle voices. Some hurried to finish chores before work. Others sipped coffee on porches cooled by a faint breeze. These were moments that felt safe and ordinary. Life carried a warmth that grew from shared history and daily habit. A shop owner unlocked his small corner store. He swept away dust in slow strokes and arranged goods along narrow shelves. A woman bought bread and chatted about weekend plans. Their exchange felt simple but meaningful. These tiny interactions formed the heartbeat of the city. In a quiet yard, an elderly man watered his plants. He paused to watch the street and nodded to neighbors who passed by. His garden held bright colors that stood out against the soft tones of the morning. He felt proud of the life he had built over many years. The city felt stable in his eyes. A teacher reviewed lesson notes at her kitchen table. She drew a slow breath and imagined the week ahead. She pictured her students and their bright, restless energy. She hoped the heat would not be too strong by midday. Her thoughts drifted through schedules and small tasks. Each detail felt manageable and clear. A cook at a local diner cracked eggs on a warm metal surface. The sound echoed softly in the narrow kitchen. He greeted coworkers with quiet humor. The air filled with the smell of butter and toasted bread. Regular customers arrived and took their usual seats. The cook moved with practiced ease and a steady sense of purpose. Along the river, tourists walked with maps folded in uncertain hands. They admired old balconies with iron rails and faded paint. Street artists sketched quick portraits. Musicians tuned instruments and tapped light rhythms on wooden cases. The city offered a blend of sound and color that felt alive. Inside the Superdome, staff made routine checks. They walked through wide halls and counted supplies. Ventilation hummed above them in a calm, steady tone. The workers shared jokes and brief stories. Nothing in the building hinted at the role it would soon play. It felt like a space ready for games and cheers, not shelter. A father helped his young son fix a loose bicycle chain. They worked together in a driveway warmed by soft sunlight. The boy smiled when the wheel turned smoothly again. The father ruffled his hair with a gentle hand. These were small victories that shaped family life. Across the city, elders sat on shaded steps and spoke about past summers. They remembered storms that came close but caused little harm. They trusted the city to endure. Their stories carried a tone of experience and calm pride. Life in New Orleans held a deep sense of connection. People relied on neighbors and familiar routines. They felt grounded by culture and community. No one sensed the sharp turn that would soon come. The city moved through its day with warm, easy energy. The air held no sign of the heavy days ahead. Throughout the early hours of the next day, the city felt a slight change in the air. The heat remained steady, but the wind carried a new tone. It brushed against windows with a sharper edge. People noticed it, but did not yet feel alarm. Life moved as usual, in slow, comfortable steps. Local radio hosts mentioned a growing storm in the Gulf. Their voices stayed calm as they shared early forecasts. Some listeners leaned closer to their radios. Others kept working without concern. Storms had formed many times before, and most passed without serious harm. The pattern felt familiar and safe. At a small grocery store, a clerk stacked cans while a customer studied a weather map on her phone. She frowned for a moment, then shook her head. She told the clerk that storms often changed direction. He nodded with a neutral smile.
Their exchange drifted away as quickly as it began. On a quiet porch, a man sipped cold tea and watched clouds build far to the south. They rose in soft towers above the horizon. He had seen skies like that in past seasons. He felt a slight tension in his chest, but tried to ignore it. The breeze carried warm air and faint hints of salt. It felt like the start of something, but not yet something to fear. Meteorologists at local stations studied satellite images with growing focus. They traced the storm path with careful fingers. Each new update showed increasing strength. Their conversations grew more serious. They prepared graphics for the next broadcast. They chose their words with caution. They knew the public listened closely during hurricane season. By late morning, news anchors delivered reports with a measured tone. They advised residents to stay alert. They repeated phrases like monitor conditions and prepare supplies. Some viewers took the advice to heart. Others shrugged with quiet confidence. The storm still seemed far away. At gas stations, small lines formed. Drivers filled their tanks with slow, deliberate motions. A few people bought bottled water and simple snacks. Their carts held basic items like bread and batteries. The mood remained calm, but carried an undercurrent of concern. People looked at the sky a little more often. A mother stood in line at a pharmacy with her 2 children. She purchased medicine and a small first aid kit. She told the kids they were just being careful. Her voice stayed steady, but her eyes held a hint of worry. She remembered past storms that had caused brief power outages. She hoped this one would be the same. Inside the Superdome, city officials discussed emergency plans. They reviewed supply lists and checked communication lines. They walked through large halls and measured space for possible shelter areas. The dome felt vast and echoing. It could hold thousands if needed. Still, the idea felt distant. No final decision had been made. Throughout the afternoon, the storm grew stronger. Weather alerts spread across screens with brighter colors. The projected path narrowed toward the Louisiana coast. People felt the tension rise. Some called relatives to share updates. Others stepped outside to watch the shifting sky. The wind carried a low, steady push that hinted at what was coming. Evening arrived with a heavier atmosphere. Cloud layers thickened and darkened. News stations repeated warnings every hour. Officials urged residents to prepare for possible evacuation orders. The air held a sense of waiting. The storm had not arrived yet, but its presence pressed closer with each passing moment. New Orleans moved into the night with quiet unease. The city felt the weight of early warnings settle over homes and streets. People locked windows and reviewed supplies. They listened for updates with steady attention. The storm approached with growing force. The first signs of fear began to rise within the hearts of the city. The night passed slowly as clouds thickened over New Orleans. By dawn, the light felt weaker and more distant. The sky held a dull gray tone that carried a sense of warning. The air felt heavier than the day before. People stepped outside and paused without knowing why. A quiet unease settled across the city. Wind moved through the streets in long, uneven breaths. It brushed against doors and loose signs. It rattled small branches that hung over sidewalks. People listened without speaking. The sound was not loud, but it carried a strange edge. It sounded like a promise of something larger drawing near. Families checked their supplies with slow, careful motions. They counted water jugs and simple food items. They placed flashlights in easy reach. A mother folded blankets and told her youngest child that everything was fine. Her voice stayed calm, but her hands moved with firm intent. She felt the shift in the air. A man walked his dog along a quiet block. The dog pulled toward home with tense, unsure steps. The man looked toward the horizon, where clouds rolled in, thick, low layers. He did not stay outside long. The sky felt close and pressing. He hurried back inside and locked the door behind him. Inside the Superdome, city workers prepared the space for shelter. They arranged cots in long, careful rows. They checked restrooms and emergency lighting. They tested radios and communication lines. Every task carried a sense of weight. They moved with clear purpose. The dome felt large and hollow, like a waiting chamber. By late morning, families began arriving with bags held close to their bodies. Some carried pillows. Others pushed small carts with food and clothes. A few elders leaned on family members as they walked across the wide-open floor. Their footsteps echoed under the high, curved roof. The sound felt lonely and distant.
People searched for small spaces where they could settle. They spread blankets on hard surfaces and tried to make them feel like temporary homes. Children asked questions in soft voices. Parents answered with simple comfort. A low murmur rose through the dome as more residents entered. The sound carried a quiet blend of worry and hope. Outside, the wind grew stronger. It swept through empty streets and pushed debris along sidewalks. The air no longer felt warm. It carried a cool, sharp edge that hinted at the storm's force. The first drops of rain struck windows in slow, spaced taps. They sounded like early signals of a larger rhythm forming in the distance. News stations broadcast continuous updates. Anchors spoke with steady voices, but their eyes showed concern. Radar images displayed swirling bands that moved closer with each hour. Officials urged people to stay indoors or head to shelters. The message repeated again and again. The city listened with growing tension. As evening approached, rain began to fall in heavier lines. The wind pressed against buildings with increasing strength. Streetlights flickered under the pressure. Loose objects rolled across pavement. The city felt pinned beneath the weight of the approaching storm. Every sound carried warning. Inside the Superdome, lights hummed with a soft, steady tone. Families huddled together and waited. Volunteers passed out water and simple meals. A sense of shared uncertainty filled the space. People spoke in low voices. Some prayed. Some sat in silence with hands folded tight. Everyone listened for the next shift in the storm. Night settled over the city with dark, heavy clouds. The rain beat in uneven bursts. The wind roared in distant rising waves. New Orleans held its breath as the calm before the storm faded away. The first true signs of danger pressed in from every side. The long wait for the storm's arrival had ended. Rain fell in hard, uneven sheets as the storm reached New Orleans. The early hours of the morning carried a deep, heavy darkness. Wind struck buildings with sharp, sudden force. It howled through narrow streets and pushed against every surface it touched. The city felt the first wave of chaos. Inside the Superdome, families awoke to the sound of distant impacts. The roof groaned under the growing pressure. The lights flickered in long, shaky pulses. A child cried out and clung to her mother. Volunteers moved quickly to calm people and check on weak points in the structure. No one knew how strong the storm would become. Outside, the wind tore through signs and fences. It snapped branches and sent them flying across roads. Water rushed through gutters in fast-rising streams. Streetlights shook and bent in the gusts.
Waves pushed deep into coastal streets and carried debris with violent speed. The landscape changed with every minute. Power lines swayed and sparked in the storm. A loud crack echoed across several blocks. Then darkness spread like a quick-moving curtain. Entire neighborhoods lost power. The city fell into a dim shadow, broken only by brief flashes from distant transformers. The sense of safety slipped away. Inside the dome, the loss of power created a low-rising panic. Emergency lights glowed with weak red tones. People held each other close and tried to steady their breathing. The roar of wind outside pressed against the walls. It felt like a giant force testing the building with relentless hands. Rain forced its way through damaged sections of the roof. Drops fell onto concrete and blankets. Volunteers placed buckets under the leaks. Water spread across the floor in thin, reflective layers. People shuffled to keep their belongings dry. The air grew colder. The echo of dripping water mixed with the deep rumble of the storm. A loud metallic sound shook the dome. It rolled across the space like thunder. People gasped and stared toward the ceiling. A section of roofing had suffered damage from the pressure. Officials ordered everyone to stay away from the center area. They moved families toward safer sections with firm, steady voices. Across the city, floodwaters surged through streets and climbed steps of homes. Cars floated and spun in fast-moving currents. People who stayed behind climbed to attics and rooftops. They called out for help through windows as water rose around them. The storm showed no sign of slowing. Emergency teams tried to respond, but conditions were too dangerous. Wind pushed vehicles off course. Debris blocked major roads. Communication lines failed as towers bent under the force. Crews waited for any break in the storm. They listened to radio calls that cut in and out with static. Inside the Superdome, the noise grew louder. It echoed through the vast interior like a deep, rolling drum. A mother whispered comfort to her child. An elder prayed under his breath. A teenager held a flashlight that shook in his hand. Fear settled into the crowd like a heavy, cold weight. Hours passed with no relief. The storm pounded the city again and again. People inside the dome felt small against its intensity. The walls shuddered with each strong gust. Every sound felt sharper and closer. The storm had reached its full force. Katrina pushed across New Orleans with unmatched power. It tore at homes. It filled streets with deep, swirling water. It broke the calm that once held the city. Inside the Superdome, thousands waited in fear and uncertainty. They held on to each other as the storm continued its violent path. The worst had arrived, and there was no turning back. The storm weakened through the early morning, but the damage had already been done. Inside the Superdome, people sat in silence and listened to the deep, fading roar outside. Darkness hung over the space with a heavy stillness. The air felt damp and cold. Families tried to rest, but sleep came only in short, uneasy moments. Water pooled in corners and spread across the concrete in wide, uneven patches. Blankets soaked through, and shoes grew heavy. A man lifted his child onto a stack of bags to keep her feet dry. She leaned against his chest and closed her eyes. Her breaths came slow but shaky. The father held her close and whispered soft, steady words. Volunteers moved from group to group and checked on elders who struggled with the cold. They carried small flashlights and simple supplies. Their voices stayed calm even when their faces showed worry. They tried to keep order in a space that felt too large and too crowded. Many had not slept since the storm began. A nurse knelt beside an older woman who had trouble breathing. She asked gentle questions and took her pulse with practiced hands. The woman nodded but looked exhausted. The nurse asked a young man to bring water. He hurried across the dim floor and returned with a small cup. The woman drank in slow, careful sips. The nurse stayed with her until her breathing eased. Food supplies ran low. Volunteers opened boxes with steady, deliberate motions. They passed out crackers and bottled water. People accepted them with quiet gratitude. A mother broke her share into small pieces for her children. She told them to eat slowly. She saved nothing for herself, but smiled at her kids with warm, tired eyes. The smell of damp clothing filled the air. Conversations dropped to whispers. People spoke about homes they feared were lost. Some wondered if their streets still existed. Others prayed under their breath. The uncertainty pressed against every heart. No one knew what waited outside the dome. A group of teenagers gathered near a wall and tried to charge their phones with a small battery pack. They shared quiet jokes to keep spirits up. One boy hummed a soft tune. Another told a short story about his neighborhood. Their laughter came in short bursts, but it brought comfort to those around them. Even small moments of joy felt rare and precious. A man walked slowly around the dome and checked on anyone sitting alone. He carried a towel and offered it to people who shivered. He spoke few words, but his presence felt steady. People thanked him with small nods. Kindness traveled through the crowd in simple, steady waves. Hours passed with no clear news. Radios played static for long stretches. Then a voice broke through with a weak signal. The message said that large parts of the city were flooded. It said rescue efforts had begun, but progress was slow. The message faded before anyone could hear more. People looked at each other with wide, uncertain eyes. A young woman tried to call her mother who lived across town. Her phone failed to connect. She pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. A volunteer sat beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. The woman cried silently into her hands. The volunteer stayed with her without speaking. Support did not need words. Night approached again, and the dome grew colder. People wrapped themselves in whatever they had. Some used jackets, others used towels or blankets that barely kept out the chill. The wind outside had eased, but the feeling of danger remained. The storm had passed, but survival had only begun. Inside the Superdome, thousands waited in a long, quiet endurance. They leaned on each other for strength. They shared water. They shared stories. They shared hope in small, steady pieces. The worst of the storm was over, but the struggle to survive the aftermath had just begun. Morning arrived with a faint, pale light that slipped through small openings near the upper edges of the Superdome. People stirred from uneasy sleep and sat up slowly. The air still felt cold, but less sharp than the night before. A quiet murmur grew across the vast space as families shared soft greetings. They had survived the storm. Now they waited for what came next. A volunteer walked through the rows of blankets and cots. He carried a small box of bottled water. He handed each bottle out with steady hands and gentle words. People thanked him in low voices. Their faces showed exhaustion, but also relief. Small acts of care traveled through the dome like warm currents. Sometime mid-morning, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the entrance corridors. The noise grew louder with each second. People turned their heads toward the sound. A group of National Guard members entered the dome with measured steps. Their uniforms carried dust and dampness. Their expressions held focus and concern. The sight of them sparked a wave of emotion. A child lifted her head from her mother's lap. An elder straightened his back and wiped his eyes. Families pressed closer together as hope moved through the crowd. The guardsmen raised their hands in calm gestures and spoke with clear, steady voices. They assured everyone that rescue efforts were underway. Medics followed behind them, carrying large backpacks filled with supplies. They moved directly toward those in need. A nurse pointed them to an elder who had grown weaker overnight. A medic knelt beside him and checked his breathing. He spoke gently and placed a warm blanket over the man's shoulders. The elder closed his eyes with relief. Water stations were set up in several corners of the dome. Guardsmen organized lines and passed out clean bottles. They spoke to children with light humor and offered smiles that cut through the weight of the last 2 days. A young boy asked if everything outside was destroyed. A guardsman paused and answered softly. He said they would do everything they could to help. The boy nodded and held the bottle close to his chest. Near one wall, a woman sat with her injured ankle wrapped in a thin cloth. A medic examined it and secured it with a sturdier bandage. He asked if she could walk. She nodded with effort. He offered his arm and helped her stand. Her sister whispered a quiet thank you. Their eyes held a mix of fear and relief. A group of volunteers worked with the rescue teams to distribute small meals. People lined up with patient steps. Some used makeshift canes. Others carried children who could not manage the walk. The meals were simple but comforting. The smell of warm food lifted the mood in small, gentle ways. In another section of the dome, a guardsman knelt beside a child who had been shaking from fear. He handed her a small flashlight. He told her it was her special light and that she could use it any time she felt scared. The girl held it tightly. Her breathing slowed. She leaned against her mother with new calm. A quiet sense of compassion spread through the shelter. People shared blankets with strangers who shivered. They poured water for elders. They helped parents calm crying babies. Bit by bit, the dome filled with a new energy. It was not joy, but it was relief shaped by human care. One woman stood up and began helping volunteers, even though she looked tired. She lifted boxes and comforted nearby families. A volunteer asked if she needed rest. She smiled and said helping others helped her heart. Her strength spread to those around her. Throughout the day, the rescue teams gathered information about those who needed medical care or evacuation. They listened carefully to names and stories. They guided people gently and promised they would not be left behind. The promise soothed many who feared being forgotten. As evening approached, the lights inside the dome glowed with a warm, steady tone. Families sat together with quieter hearts. The fear of the storm still lingered, but hope had taken root. They watched the guardsmen move through the space with tireless purpose. They felt less alone than they had hours earlier. Night settled with a softer weight than before. The sound of the wind outside had faded. Inside the Superdome, people rested with a fragile but growing sense of safety. Compassion had turned the cold, vast shelter into something warmer. It felt like a place where survival might become healing. The first buses arrived at the Superdome before dawn. Their engines hummed with a low, steady sound that echoed across the entrance ramps. People sat up from their blankets and looked toward the noise with cautious hope. The National Guard moved through the dome and called for families who were ready to leave. Their voices carried warmth, but also urgency. It was time to step into the aftermath. Evacuation lines formed with slow, uneven steps. Parents held children close. Elders leaned on volunteers for support. People carried bags packed with whatever they still had. Many carried almost nothing. A few held only photographs or small keepsakes they had managed to save. These items felt heavier than their size. They held the memories of homes now lost. Outside the dome, the morning air felt cooler. The sky showed thin streaks of pale blue through wide gray clouds. The wind no longer roared, but carried the faint scent of floodwater and broken wood. People breathed in the smell and paused. It told them the truth before they even saw the streets. Their city had changed. As buses rolled through the outskirts of downtown, the scale of the damage came into view. Streets were covered with deep water that reflected the broken sky. Homes sat tilted or half submerged. Cars floated in odd positions against fences and light posts. Trees lay uprooted, with tangled branches stretched across roads. Silence sat over the ruins like a heavy blanket. A woman pressed her face to the bus window and covered her mouth with her hand. She whispered the name of her street. She tried to find familiar shapes among the debris. Nothing looked like home. Her daughter leaned against her and asked if their house was safe. The woman took a long breath before answering. She said they would face it together. The child nodded and held her hand tight. A man recognized the corner store where he used to buy coffee each morning. The windows were shattered. The roof had collapsed inward. He stared without blinking. His grief did not come in tears. It came in a long, silent stillness. Other passengers placed gentle hands on his shoulder. Their touch carried the weight of shared loss. When buses reached higher ground, people stepped out and gathered in groups. They looked across the horizon at flooded neighborhoods stretching far into the distance. Some fell to their knees. Others stood with rigid posture, as if their bodies tried to contain the shock. Voices rose in quiet cries and broken whispers. The air felt thick with sorrow. Relief workers guided families toward temporary shelters. They offered blankets, warm drinks, and simple meals. People accepted them with shaky hands. Many had not eaten more than small rations in days. The taste of warm food brought both comfort and pain. It reminded them of normal life, now far away. Reporters moved through the area with cameras and microphones. They captured images of destruction and grief. Some survivors spoke when asked. Others turned away. A mother told a reporter that she did not know if her parents were safe. A man said he had lost contact with his brother. Their words fell like heavy stones into the still air. In one shelter, an elder sat on a folding chair and stared at a soaked photograph in his hands. It showed his home before the storm. A child sat beside him and asked about the picture. The elder described the porch and the old oak tree that shaded it. His voice shook but softened at the memory. The child listened with quiet sympathy. Families gathered in small circles. They shared stories of what they had seen during the storm. Some spoke about neighbors they had not heard from. Others described narrow escapes. Their voices carried a blend of fear and gratitude. They supported each other through the long, uncertain hours. As evening approached, the sky returned to a soft, dim gray. Floodwaters reflected the fading light in wide, still pools. The city seemed to breathe in slow, wounded sighs. Survivors sat together in silence and watched the horizon. They felt the weight of loss settle deeper into their hearts. The storm had passed, but its shadow remained. In the quiet of the night, a single truth settled across every survivor. They had endured the storm, but now they faced the harder part. They had to endure the loss that followed.
Morning light spread across the shelters with a muted gray tone. Survivors rose slowly and moved with quiet care. The storm was gone, yet a heavy stillness lingered. People carried stories they had not spoken. These were the stories that rarely reached cameras, the quiet truths behind the disaster. A woman sat near a window and opened a worn notebook. She wrote names of neighbors she had not seen since the storm. Some had stayed behind to help the elderly. Others vanished during the flood. She paused after each name and closed her eyes with gentle sorrow. Each name felt like a fragile link to the life she once knew. Across the room, an elder lay on a cot with his hands folded. He spoke to a volunteer about a neighbor who brought him groceries each weekend. He had not seen the man since the water rose. His voice trembled with each sentence. The volunteer listened with steady patience. The elder's words drifted through the quiet room like small, grief-filled echoes. A teenager held a cracked phone that refused to connect. She had tried for days to reach her older brother. He had stayed behind to help families leave their building. She whispered that he was brave. She whispered that he promised to return. She tried again with shaking hands. Her hope rose and fell with each failed attempt. Near a corner, a man sat with tired shoulders. He had guided people through flooded streets. He carried children on his back and knocked on doors until he felt weak. He said he hoped the people he could not reach had found safety. His guilt pressed against him, though he had done much. Others nearby offered soft words that eased him for a moment. In another section, a mother rocked her infant with slow motions. She spoke about a neighbor who had helped them escape rising water. She had not seen him since. She prayed that he had reached shelter. Her voice held gratitude and fear. She told a volunteer that she wanted to thank him if she ever saw him again. A woman sat alone with a soaked photograph of her parents. They had stayed in their home because they believed the storm would pass. She had not heard from them. A relief worker sat beside her and placed a hand on her back. The woman cried without sound. The worker stayed until her breathing steadied.
Stories like these moved through the shelter in soft waves. None were dramatic. They carried grief shaped by courage and loss. These were the stories that revealed the deeper cost of the storm. They formed a quiet map of bravery hidden in ordinary lives. Outside, volunteers organized lists of missing people. Names filled large boards in uneven lines. Some names were crossed out when families reunited. Others remained untouched for days. People stood before the boards and searched with hopeful fear. They traced each name with cautious eyes. A young man stepped forward and added his sister's name to the list. She had stayed behind to help neighbors who could not walk. He stared at the letters for a long moment. He hoped someone would recognize the name. He hoped she would find safety. A volunteer assured him that her name would be watched closely. As the afternoon settled, the air grew warmer. People gathered in small circles and shared quiet memories. They spoke about those who had helped them escape. They spoke about loved ones they could not reach. Their voices carried sorrow and respect. These small groups formed gentle islands of comfort. A relief worker moved through the shelter and read out names of people who had been found safe. Every name brought a soft spark of hope. People clapped in gentle rhythms. Some cried with relief. Others stepped closer to ask for news. The worker answered questions with calm patience. Evening brought pale lavender light through open doors. Survivors wrapped themselves in blankets and settled for the night. They held on to hope in fragile pieces. They carried grief for those still missing. They whispered quiet promises to remember them. Night fell with gentle calm. Forgotten stories lingered like soft echoes. They belonged to the brave and the lost. They belonged to the ones who waited and the ones who never returned. These stories formed the deeper truth of the storm, and they lived on in the hearts of those who survived. Morning arrived with a gentle quiet that felt different from the days before. Survivors woke with slow, steady breaths. The storm had passed, yet its weight remained in every heart. People moved through the shelter with careful steps. They carried memories of fear, but also the first signs of healing. A woman stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. The sky held a soft silver tone across the city. She closed her eyes and felt warm air on her face. She thought about the long days inside the Superdome. She had feared for her children. Now she breathed with a fragile sense of peace. She whispered that calm felt strange but welcome. Nearby, a man sat on a bench provided by relief workers. In his hands he held the name of his brother. He had learned that his brother had reached safety after the storm. The news felt unreal. He read the name again and again. Each reading brought a small rise of relief. He pressed the paper to his chest and closed his eyes. At a temporary shelter, families gathered for warm breakfast. They spoke about where they planned to go. Some hoped to return to their neighborhoods and search for what remained. Others would move to new towns to stay with relatives. A few had nowhere certain to go. Volunteers assured them that support would continue. Their voices carried calm, steady comfort. A nurse moved through the shelter with patient steps. She checked on those who had grown sick during the storm. She helped people stand. She gave gentle instructions on care and rest. She told them that healing would take time. Her voice carried honest hope. People listened with gratitude. Her presence felt like a quiet anchor. Children played in a small open area set up near the entrance. They tossed a soft ball back and forth. Their voices rose in light laughter. Parents watched with tired eyes, but smiled at the sound. The return of children's laughter felt like a small promise that life could grow again. A volunteer knelt beside them and joined their play for a moment. An elder sat with a volunteer and spoke about his home. He knew it had been damaged, but he also knew he had survived. He said the storm had taken much, but not his spirit. He hoped to see his street again. The volunteer listened with respect. Their quiet talk carried the strength of shared endurance. A woman held a small radio close to her ear. News reports discussed cleanup and rebuilding. They mentioned support from across the country. People had sent supplies and opened their homes. She whispered that she felt less alone. She said the kindness of strangers felt like a new beginning. Later in the day, buses arrived to move families to new shelters or to bring them closer to their homes. People gathered their few belongings. They helped elders stand. They lifted children into their arms. The National Guard guided them with steady gestures. Their presence brought comfort and order. A small group of survivors walked along a higher road where floodwaters had begun to recede. They looked across the city at broken roofs and fallen trees. The sight hurt their hearts. Yet they stood with quiet strength. They had lived through fear and loss. They carried the memory of each moment. They said they would rebuild in whatever way they could. A woman knelt and touched the wet ground. She whispered that she would rebuild. She said the city still had a soul worth saving. Her calm resolve spread to those beside her. People nodded with shared belief. They felt a slow rise of determination. As evening approached, the sky turned a soft gold. The light reflected across the water in warm, gentle waves. Survivors watched the glow and felt the first hints of closure. They knew the road ahead would be long. They knew rebuilding would take time, but they also knew they were not alone. Their shared hope formed a quiet bond. In the shelters, families sat together and spoke about their futures. They shared quiet dreams of returning home. They talked about memory and loss. They held on to hope that tomorrow would be kinder than yesterday. Their soft voices rose and fell in gentle rhythm. Night settled with a peaceful tone. Survivors lay on their blankets and closed their eyes. They carried sadness, but also courage. They carried the memory of those they had lost. They carried the promise to rebuild. They held the belief that healing would come step by step. In the quiet of that night, one truth rested in every heart. They would remember the storm. They would remember the darkness. But they would also remember the hands that helped them, the voices that comforted them, the strength that rose from within them. This was their legacy, not only the storm they survived, but the hope they carried forward.